Russian President Vladimir Putin, meanwhile, delivering his State of the Nation address this morning. He announced that Moscow will suspend its participation of the New START nuclear arms treaty. Putin also spent time on Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which started nearly 1 year ago. Watch.
Responsibility for fomenting the Ukrainian conflict, for its escalation, and for the increasing number of victims lies entirely with Western elites. And, of course, the current regime in Kyiv, for which the Ukrainian people are essentially strangers.
President Biden is scheduled to deliver his own remarks on Russia's war later today, one day after his surprise visit to Kyiv yesterday. Joining me right now is Fox News' senior strategic analyst, chairman of the Institute for the Study of War, General Jack Keane. General, it's good to see you. Thanks very much for being here. Of course, our hearts go out to all of the people of Ukraine. America has been incredibly supportive. But what are your thoughts on what this visit does, the president showing up in Kyiv, and more money sent to Ukraine? We're up to $113 billion funds committed.
Well, first of all, I commend the president for getting there. It is significant that he goes into the war zone and visits President Zelensky. There's nothing like being on the ground, certainly. I think he should have been there last summer, to be frank about it, but I'm delighted that he went. I totally agree with the funding in Ukraine. I take issue with your former guest here, who made statements that, well, we've got the problem at the southern border, and we got the problem in Ohio, we got the problem with fentanyl. Does anybody really believe that if we pulled the plug on the funding in Ukraine and let Russia, China, and Iran be victors there, that we will actually somehow solve the problem on the southern border, the fentanyl problem, and our government will be more responsive to the needs of the American people when they have a catastrophe like what's taken place in Ohio? I don't think so. These things are not mutually exclusive. We've got a country, a democracy, that has been invaded by Russia. China has refused to call out the invasion, has refused to say it's illegal, has refused to oppose the genocide and war crimes that are being committed there. They are providing, as we know right now, commercial drones to help Russia. They are thinking about providing military aid to Russia. And yes, are we concerned about China? You betcha. And if the United States and the West loses to political will and the moral compass to stand up for a democracy in Europe, what is the message that we are going to send to China? Is that going to be an incentive for them to validate what President Xi has already said? The United States is a declining power. And if we underscore Russia's victory in Ukraine and China and Iran's support of that, that will be a seminal event for China to get more aggressive. And we know we are outgunned and outmanned in the Indo-Pacific region. Yeah. We've got to face the world as it really is and face up to some of the responsibilities. We got a $6 trillion budget, Maria, and we're talking about $100 billion here. The amount of money that the Biden administration spends on other things domestically, I'm not an expert on it, but most of it I don't particularly agree with. I do think this is a return on investment to spend this kind of money to guarantee the freedom of the Ukrainian people, but particularly to oppose the aggression of Russia, which is being supported by Iran and China.
Yeah, all really important points, General, but why are we funding the expansion of the Chinese Communist Party? I mean, we have done nothing in terms of pushing back on China's provocations. We've got China claiming to push back after the U.S. said that Beijing is considering sending, quote, lethal aid to Russia for its war in Ukraine. But here's China's foreign ministry spokesperson and what he said about this yesterday. Watch this.
It is the U.S. who kept providing weapons to the battlefield, not China. The U.S. is in no position to tell us what to do, and we would never accept its finger-pointing and even coercion and pressure on China-Russia relations. We never accept any bossing around, coercing, or pressure from the United States on China-Russia relations.
So here we have him once again trying to dress down the United States. Let's be clear. The China issue is not just about Ukraine. The China issue is about China's provocations on the United States. We've got this spy tool in this, this spy balloon that was able to hover above military installations, our nuclear installations. We haven't heard a word from President Biden pushing back to China on that. And this is after China was able to unleash, accidentally or not, a virus that killed 1 million people in America and then try to cover it up. We've had no pushback whatsoever in terms of getting to the origins of COVID-19. So when you're looking at China, I don't think we could only look at China and its support of Russia, which we know is obvious, but it's even more than that. What has this administration done to that? Counter China's provocations?
Well, I've been talking to you for years about China's provocations, Maria.
That's right.
Please,
you were the first person to say we were outgunned and outmanned and that we need to invest in our military because they have a bigger Navy than we are. But I don't hear that from this administration.
Well, let's just get to the specifics right in front of us. A year ago, China was going to provide lethal aid to Russia. This administration, I give them some credit, quietly, not publicly, called them out of that, and they didn't do it. I actually applaud them calling them out publicly now. The EU has come out and said very unequivocally, the relationship with China will change if they provide lethal aid to Russia. It will be a red line for us. If China provides this lethal aid, the United States and the EU and Europe will be much more aligned than we have ever been in terms of anti-China policies. You know full well that there are countries inside of Europe that have a sweetheart relationship with China. They push back publicly on their aggressive policy and increase their economic ties. The United States should be trying to decouple some of these ties that make sense. We know we're not going to decouple the whole economy, but anything that's helping the military, anything that is helping the repression of the Chinese people, you betcha we got to be decoupling that. I think China will make a fatal mistake if they provide these lethal arms, and I think it's possible they won't because of the public reaction that's taken place. And I give the administration some credit. While I'm very critical of them on how they're dealing with Ukraine and not giving them enough to win the war, this factor, I think, is a good step to pushing back on China publicly at this time.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned companies because that's who I'm referring to, corporate America, who is funding the expansion of the CCP by investing in these companies, in all the indexes and in the thrift fund and all the rest. But of course, we know that they're not going to stop until policy changes. It starts with policy. So that's why I have to go back to this administration and point the finger in terms of the pushback on China. And the president keeps calling China a competitor. It's an adversary. I think that they've made that clear. General, it's always a pleasure to see you and to speak with you about all of these very important topics. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, great talking, Maria. Wonderful.
And to you, General Jack Keane.